Miss Marple and Murder Beneath the Nile.
Chapter 1. A letter from the Nile. The morning in St. Mary Mead arrived quietly, the way it always did, slow, gentle, and almost politely. Pale sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's small cottage, resting softly on the polished wooden floor and the little round table beside her chair. Miss Marple herself sat comfortably by the bay window, knitting needles clicking together with a calm, steady rhythm. Outside, the narrow village lane was already beginning to stir with life. A milk cart creaked past the hedges, and somewhere beyond the gardens a rooster announced the new day with proud enthusiasm. To any stranger, St. Mary Mead looked like the most peaceful place in England. Miss Marple, however, knew better. She had lived long enough to understand that human nature rarely changed simply because a place looked quiet. Even the most charming villages often hid jealousy, secrets, and strange little dramas beneath their tidy hedges. Still, the morning itself felt unusually pleasant. Miss Marple paused her knitting and looked thoughtfully out the window. The roses in her garden were beginning to bloom, their soft pink petals opening toward the sun. It was a lovely sight. Just then the door opened gently, and her maid Susan stepped inside carrying a small stack of letters. Susan had been with Miss Marple for several years. She was young, practical, and cheerful, and she managed the little household with admirable efficiency. "Your morning letters, miss," Susan said, placing them neatly on the small table. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and picked up the top envelope. "Thank you, Susan." The envelope was thick and cream-coloured, addressed in confident handwriting. Miss Marple studied it for a moment before opening it carefully. "Oh," she said softly. Susan looked curious. "Good news, miss?" Miss Marple smiled faintly as she unfolded the letter. "It appears that Mr. David Carter remembers his old friends." Susan tilted her head slightly. "The gentleman who visited last summer with his wife?" "The very same," Miss Marple replied. She began reading aloud. "Dear Miss Marple, Mary and I are presently staying in Egypt for a few weeks. The doctor has advised warm sunshine for Mary's health, and we have taken rooms at a hotel beside the Nile. The place is quite charming, palm trees, warm evenings, and a most fascinating view of the desert." Miss Marple paused briefly. Susan leaned forward with growing interest. "Egypt, miss?" Miss Marple continued reading. "Mary often speaks of your kindness and wisdom, and we would both be delighted if you would consider joining us here for a short visit. I believe you might enjoy the history and beauty of this remarkable country." Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. "Well," she said thoughtfully, "that is rather unexpected." Susan's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Egypt must be wonderful, miss. The pyramids and the desert and the Nile River." Miss Marple chuckled gently. "Yes, my dear, quite a change from the hedges of St. Mary Mead." She placed the letter on the table and looked again through the window toward her garden. The idea of travel had not occurred to her in quite some time, yet the thought of seeing a new place, especially one as ancient and mysterious as Egypt, was strangely appealing. Susan hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke quietly. "Miss, if you decide to go, may I ask something?" Miss Marple turned toward her kindly. "Of course." Susan clasped her hands nervously. "I've always dreamed of travelling somewhere far away. I've never been outside England." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "Well," she said after a moment, "every traveller requires someone sensible to help manage luggage." Susan's face lit up with delight. "You mean—" Miss Marple smiled. "I believe we shall both see the Nile, Susan." Susan laughed with excitement. "Oh, miss, that would be wonderful." Preparations began almost immediately. Over the next several days, Miss Marple packed carefully and methodically, placing her knitting, spectacles, and a few sensible dresses into a modest suitcase. Susan handled the practical arrangements with great enthusiasm, checking travel schedules and organizing the smaller luggage. The quiet cottage soon buzzed with activity. Before their departure, Miss Marple received a visitor. Colonel Bantry, an old friend of many years, stopped by to wish her well. "Egypt!" the Colonel exclaimed when he heard the news. "Now that's an adventure, Jane." Miss Marple smiled politely. "I hope it will simply be a pleasant holiday." The Colonel chuckled. "My dear lady, whenever you travel somewhere, trouble has a habit of appearing." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I assure you, Colonel, I intend nothing more exciting than sunshine and peaceful sightseeing." But as she said this, Miss Marple felt a small and curious thought stir quietly in the back of her mind. She had long ago learned that peaceful holidays often turned out otherwise. 2 days later, Miss Marple and Susan left St. Mary Mead. The familiar village lanes disappeared behind them as their train carried them south toward the coast. Soon they would board a ship bound for the Mediterranean. Susan stood on the deck later that evening, watching the sea stretch endlessly beneath the fading sunlight. "It's all so beautiful," she said softly. Miss Marple stood beside her. "Yes," she agreed. Far away, beneath the warm Egyptian sun, the Nile flowed silently through the ancient desert. Palm trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. And somewhere along its quiet banks a chain of events had already begun. Events that would soon pull Miss Marple into another mystery of human fear, deception, and deadly secrets. For although the Nile carried the beauty of centuries, it also carried shadows. And one of those shadows was waiting for them. Chapter 2. Shadows at the Sphinx View. The Sphinx View Hotel stood proudly beside the slow, shining waters of the Nile. Its white stone walls glowed beneath the golden Egyptian sun, and tall palm trees swayed gently in the warm desert breeze. From the upper balconies, guests could see the river stretching endlessly across the landscape, reflecting the sky like polished glass. For Miss Marple, the sight was both beautiful and strangely peaceful. After many hours of travel by ship and train, she and Susan finally arrived at the hotel late in the afternoon. The heat of Egypt was very different from the cool air of St. Mary Mead. The sunlight felt heavier here, brighter and more intense, as if the desert itself held the sun closer than anywhere else in the world. Inside the hotel lobby, however, the air was cool and calm. Large marble pillars supported the high ceiling, and soft rugs covered the polished floor. A few guests sat quietly reading newspapers or sipping tea beside tall windows that looked out toward the river. Susan looked around in amazement. "Oh, miss, it's wonderful," she whispered. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, my dear, quite impressive indeed." Before they could admire the place much longer, a familiar voice called across the lobby. "Miss Marple." Miss Marple turned to see a tall gentleman walking quickly toward them. David Carter looked just as energetic as she remembered him. He was neatly dressed, with a confident manner and a wide smile that suggested he was very pleased to see them. "My dear Miss Marple," he said warmly, shaking her hand, "you cannot imagine how delighted Mary and I are that you accepted our invitation." Behind him stood Mary Carter. Mary was a gentlewoman with soft features and kind eyes, though Miss Marple noticed immediately that she looked somewhat pale and tired. Her movements were slower, as if she had not fully recovered from whatever illness had troubled her during the winter. "Miss Marple," Mary said warmly, "how lovely it is to see you again." Miss Marple returned the greeting kindly. "My dear Mrs. Carter, you look much better already. I suspect the Egyptian sunshine will do wonders for your health." Mary smiled faintly. "I hope so." David quickly called a porter to carry their luggage upstairs. Susan was shown to a comfortable room on the second floor, while Miss Marple received a slightly larger room with a balcony that overlooked the Nile. From there she could see small boats drifting quietly along the water and distant desert hills glowing softly beneath the afternoon light. Later that evening, the group gathered in the hotel courtyard for dinner. The courtyard was one of the hotel's most charming features. Lanterns hung from the palm trees, casting warm golden light across the stone tables. The scent of jasmine flowers drifted gently through the air. The Nile could be seen just beyond the garden wall, its surface reflecting the moonlight like silver. Dinner began pleasantly enough. David was in high spirits and spoke enthusiastically about the local sites they would soon visit. "The temples here are extraordinary," he said excitedly, "and the market streets are unlike anything you'll see in England." Miss Marple listened politely, while Susan admired the surroundings with quiet fascination. Mary spoke very little. She seemed content simply to sit quietly and enjoy the warm evening air. Partway through dinner, David glanced toward the entrance of the courtyard. "Ah, there they are," he said. Two new guests approached their table. The first was a tall Egyptian gentleman with calm eyes and a composed manner. "This is my friend Karim Hassan," David explained. Karim greeted Miss Marple politely. "It is an honor to meet you," he said warmly. "Mr. Carter has spoken highly of you." Beside him stood his sister. Layla Hassan was strikingly beautiful. Her dark hair framed her face neatly, and her expression carried a quiet confidence. Yet there was something about her watchful gaze that made Miss Marple feel she was carefully studying everyone around her. David continued the introductions. "And this is Karim's sister, Layla." Layla nodded politely. "I hope you enjoy your stay in Egypt," she said softly. The group soon resumed their conversation. Karim spoke comfortably about the history of the city and offered to guide them through several famous sites the following day. David seemed particularly eager for the arrangement. "Perfect," he said. "You know the best places." Miss Marple listened quietly while observing the table. It was a habit she had developed over many years. She rarely spoke much at first meetings, preferring instead to watch the small details of human behavior. And already she noticed something curious. Whenever Layla spoke, David seemed unusually attentive. At times, their conversation drifted slightly apart from the rest of the group. Once or twice, Layla leaned closer to David as if to say something quietly. Miss Marple said nothing. Perhaps it was nothing at all. After dinner, the group stood briefly beside the garden wall overlooking the Nile. The moonlight shimmered across the water, and the distant desert hills appeared like silent shadows against the sky. Susan seemed enchanted by the view. "It feels like another world," she whispered. Miss Marple nodded softly. "Yes, my dear." The river moved slowly through the darkness, carrying centuries of history within its silent flow. And yet Miss Marple could not shake a strange feeling. Something about the evening's quiet conversations, the subtle glances exchanged across the dinner table, and the watchful expression in Layla's eyes left her with a faint but unmistakable sense of unease. Miss Marple had learned long ago that such feelings were rarely meaningless. Often they were the first sign that beneath a calm surface, something far more troubling was beginning to unfold. And though the Nile flowed peacefully beneath the moonlight that night, Miss Marple sensed that somewhere nearby a secret had already begun to grow. Chapter 3. A Secret Beneath the Sun. The following morning in Egypt began with a golden sunrise spreading slowly across the Nile. The air was warm already, though the day had only just begun. From the balcony of the Sphinx View Hotel, Miss Marple watched the river moving quietly through the landscape like a ribbon of silver. Small boats drifted lazily across the water, and the distant desert shimmered softly beneath the rising sun. Susan appeared at the doorway, carrying a small tray with tea. "Good morning, miss," she said cheerfully. "I thought you might enjoy tea before breakfast." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Thank you, Susan. This place certainly has its charm." Susan stepped onto the balcony and looked out at the river with wide eyes. "It feels like we've travelled back in time," she said. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Egypt does have that effect." A short while later, they joined the others in the hotel dining room for breakfast. The room was bright and airy, with tall windows allowing sunlight to flood across the white tablecloths. David Carter was already seated at the table, reading a guidebook with great enthusiasm. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said brightly, "today we shall see the real Egypt." Mary sat quietly beside him, sipping her tea slowly. She looked slightly tired, but seemed pleased to be part of the outing. Moments later, Karim Hassan entered the room, followed by his sister Layla. "Good morning," Karim said warmly. "I hope everyone slept well." Layla greeted them politely but spoke very little. Her dark eyes moved calmly from one person to another, as if she were quietly studying the group. Soon the group set out for the day. Karim drove them through the lively streets of the nearby market district. The narrow roads were crowded with people, animals, and colourful stalls selling spices, fabrics, and small carved souvenirs. Susan seemed delighted by everything she saw. "Oh, miss, look at those lamps," she said excitedly. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, quite remarkable." After visiting the market, Karim guided them toward a small ancient temple site that stood on a hill overlooking the Nile. The stone pillars were worn by centuries of wind and sun, yet the place held a quiet beauty. Miss Marple walked slowly behind the others, her eyes taking in the surroundings carefully. It was during this quiet moment that she first noticed something unusual. David and Layla had moved slightly ahead of the group. They were speaking quietly together. Their conversation stopped immediately when Susan approached from behind them. Layla stepped back quickly. David laughed awkwardly and began talking loudly about the temple architecture. Miss Marple said nothing, but she noticed the brief tension in the air. Later that afternoon, the group returned to the hotel. The sun had grown hot, and everyone seemed slightly tired from the day's walking. Miss Marple decided to rest for a while in the hotel garden. The garden was shaded by palm trees, and a gentle breeze moved through the leaves. As she sat quietly on a stone bench, she noticed Susan standing near the far side of the garden. Susan looked troubled. Miss Marple walked slowly toward her. "My dear Susan," she said gently, "you seem worried." Susan looked startled. "Oh, miss, I didn't hear you." Miss Marple studied her face carefully. "You have something on your mind." Susan hesitated. Then she spoke quietly. "Miss, sometimes servants notice things that guests don't." Miss Marple waited patiently. Susan glanced toward the hotel building. "I might have seen something yesterday evening," she said slowly. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "What sort of thing?" Susan lowered her voice. "I saw Mr. David and Miss Layla together near the garden after dinner. They were arguing about something." Miss Marple said nothing. Susan continued nervously. "When they saw me, they both went silent." Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. "Did they say anything to you?" Susan shook her head. "No, but Miss Layla looked very angry." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Well, my dear, misunderstandings between people are quite common." But her eyes had grown thoughtful. Susan seemed uncertain. "I hope I'm mistaken, miss. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Perhaps you are. But as Miss Marple returned to the garden bench, her thoughts were far from calm. In her long experience of observing human nature, she had learned something very important. Secrets rarely remained hidden forever. And when people tried very hard to hide something, it usually meant that the truth was far more serious than anyone wished to admit. Miss Marple looked toward the hotel building where the others had gone inside. The sunlight glowed warmly across the garden. Yet despite the peaceful scene, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. Somewhere within this small group of travelers, a dangerous secret had begun to grow. And secrets, as Miss Marple knew very well, often led to terrible consequences. Chapter 4. The Maid Who Vanished. The evening arrived quietly over the Nile, and the golden sunlight slowly faded into a deep amber glow across the desert horizon. The air had cooled slightly, and the hotel courtyard of the Sphinx View was filled with the soft murmur of guests enjoying the calm Egyptian night. Lanterns hung from the palm trees, casting warm circles of light across the stone floor. Somewhere nearby, faint music drifted from the hotel lounge, blending with the gentle sound of the river flowing beyond the garden walls. Miss Marple sat comfortably at one of the courtyard tables with David, Mary, Kareem, and Layla. Dinner had been pleasant, though Miss Marple noticed that the conversation was not quite as relaxed as it had been the night before. David spoke energetically about their next day's plans. Yes, but there was a slight tension in his voice that had not been there earlier. Mary remained quiet most of the evening, listening politely, but speaking very little. Kareem seemed calm and courteous as always, while Layla appeared thoughtful, her dark eyes occasionally drifting toward the hotel entrance as if she were expecting someone. After some time, Miss Marple noticed something curious. "Susan seems to be taking a long time," she said gently. Mary looked around the courtyard. "Oh yes," she said. "She said she was going upstairs for a moment." Miss Marple glanced toward the staircase that led to the guest rooms. Susan was usually very punctual, especially when Miss Marple required her assistance. Another 15 minutes passed. Still no Susan. Miss Marple stood slowly. "I believe I shall see if everything is quite all right." She walked toward the staircase and made her way quietly to the second floor. The corridor was peaceful and dimly lit, with only the soft glow of wall lamps illuminating the carpeted hallway. Susan's room was near the end of the corridor. Miss Marple knocked gently. There was no reply. She knocked again, still silence. Miss Marple slowly turned the handle and opened the door. The room was empty. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but as Miss Marple stepped inside, she immediately noticed something strange. The bed was untouched. Susan had clearly not returned to the room since morning. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across the room. Then she saw it. A small white handkerchief lay on the floor beside the bed. Miss Marple bent down carefully and picked it up. It was Susan's. Miss Marple recognized the delicate stitching along the edge. Susan always carried it in the pocket of her apron. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Susan was a very neat and orderly girl. She would never have left her room in such a careless state. Something was wrong. Miss Marple left the room and returned to the courtyard where the others were still seated. David looked up when she approached. "Everything all right?" Miss Marple spoke calmly, though her voice carried a quiet seriousness. "I'm afraid Susan is not in her room." Mary looked surprised. "That's odd. I thought she came upstairs earlier." Kareem frowned slightly. "Perhaps she went for a walk." Layla said nothing, though her expression seemed briefly tense. Miss Marple shook her head. "I find that unlikely." David stood up immediately. "Well, we should look for her." Within minutes, the hotel staff was searching the building. They checked every corridor, every lounge, the garden, even the small riverside terrace behind the hotel. But Susan was nowhere to be found. The peaceful atmosphere of the evening slowly began to change. Guests whispered quietly among themselves while the hotel manager spoke nervously with the staff. Miss Marple stood near the courtyard entrance, thinking carefully. Something about the situation troubled her deeply. Susan had not taken her coat, nor her handbag, and her room had clearly not been used since morning. After a long moment, Miss Marple turned toward David. "I believe we should inform the police." David hesitated. "Do you think that's necessary?" Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "My dear Mr. Carter," she said gently, "when a sensible young woman disappears without explanation, it is always wise to act quickly." Mary nodded slowly. "Yes, perhaps Miss Marple is right." Kareem also agreed. "I know the local inspector. He will take the matter seriously." Layla remained very quiet. Within half an hour, David and Kareem were preparing to drive to the nearby police station. Miss Marple watched them leave from the hotel entrance. The Nile flowed silently beyond the garden wall. The night air was warm and still. But Miss Marple felt a faint and troubling certainty growing in her mind. In her long life, she had learned something important about sudden disappearances. Very often, they were only the beginning of something far more tragic. And though she hoped with all her heart that Susan would soon return safely, Miss Marple could not ignore the quiet voice of experience that whispered otherwise. Somewhere beyond the hotel walls, something terrible had already happened, and the mystery of Susan's disappearance had only just begun. Chapter 5: Death on the Desert Path. The following morning dawned bright and still over the Nile. From the balconies of the Sphinx View Hotel, the river looked peaceful beneath the early sunlight, its waters shining like polished silver. Yet inside the hotel, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. The disappearance of Susan had unsettled everyone. Miss Marple had slept very little during the night. She had spent many quiet hours sitting by the window of her room, watching the moonlight over the river and thinking carefully about everything that had happened. Now, as the morning sun rose, the police had already begun their search. Inspector Farouk arrived shortly after dawn. He was a calm, thoughtful man with sharp eyes and a serious manner. 2 constables accompanied him, and together they began questioning the hotel staff and the guests. David and Kareem had explained the situation clearly. Susan had been seen leaving the courtyard the previous evening. After that, no one had noticed where she went. Inspector Farouk listened carefully. "We will search the surrounding area," he said firmly. "If the girl walked beyond the hotel grounds, someone may have seen her." Miss Marple watched the proceedings quietly from a nearby chair. Her knitting rested in her lap, though she had not made a single stitch all morning. Something about the entire situation disturbed her deeply. Susan had not been careless. She had not been foolish. She would never wander away alone without reason, which meant something else must have happened. A short time later, the search party set out. The land behind the Sphinx View Hotel was very different from the pleasant gardens beside the river. A narrow path led away from the building toward a stretch of dry land, scattered with low trees and patches of desert brush. The ground was uneven and dusty. Inspector Farouk walked ahead with the 2 constables, while David, Kareem, and Miss Marple followed at a slower pace. The morning sun was already growing warm. For several minutes, the group searched quietly. Then suddenly, one of the constables stopped. "Inspector!" he called sharply. Everyone turned. The constable was standing near a cluster of low bushes beside the path. Inspector Farouk moved quickly toward him. Miss Marple followed slowly behind. When she reached the spot, she saw immediately what the constable had found. She saw immediately what the constable had found. Susan lay on the ground. Her body rested partly beneath the branches of a small tree. Her apron was torn and dust covered her clothes. Her face was pale and still. For a moment, no one spoke. Mary, who had insisted on joining the search despite her weak health, covered her mouth in horror. "Oh, no!" Inspector Farouk knelt beside the body and examined her carefully. After a few moments, he looked up grimly. "She has been strangled." The terrible words hung in the warm morning air. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Poor Susan. The girl had been cheerful and hard-working, and she had trusted the people around her. Now she lay lifeless beneath the desert sun. Inspector Farouk turned to the constables. "Secure the area." Then he stood and looked carefully at the ground surrounding the body. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. She had always believed that the smallest details often revealed the greatest truths. And already she noticed several things. The dry earth near the path showed clear signs of struggle. The dust had been disturbed, and faint marks suggested that Susan had tried to defend herself. Then Miss Marple saw something else. Near the edge of the path, half buried in the sand, lay a small black object. She bent carefully and picked it up. It was a button, a thick, dark wooden button, the kind commonly found on heavy coats. Miss Marple turned it thoughtfully in her fingers. Then her eyes moved to the ground again. A short distance from the body, she noticed several deep footprints in the dust. They were large, clearly the footprints of a man wearing heavy boots. Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment, studying the marks. Inspector Farouk approached her. "Did you notice something?" Miss Marple held out the button. "This may be important." The inspector examined it carefully. "From a coat, perhaps?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes. She looked once more at the disturbed earth surrounding Susan's body. Something about the scene troubled her. The footprints suggested a man, yet the struggle marks seemed oddly uneven. Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. "Inspector," she said gently, "I believe Susan knew the person who attacked her." Inspector Farouk studied her for a moment. "What makes you think that?" Miss Marple glanced toward the quiet hotel building in the distance. "Because people rarely allow strangers to come close enough to harm them," she said quietly. The inspector nodded slowly. He understood what she meant. This was not a random attack. Someone Susan trusted had led her to this lonely path. And that realization made the mystery far darker than anyone had expected. As the constables carefully prepared to move the body, Miss Marple looked once more at the dusty ground. The Nile flowed peacefully in the distance, but here, beneath the silent desert sun, a terrible secret had just begun to reveal itself. And Miss Marple felt certain that the truth, when it finally appeared, would be far more complicated than it seemed. Chapter 6. Footprints of Deception. The atmosphere inside the Sphinx View Hotel had changed completely after the discovery of Susan's body. What had once been a peaceful holiday retreat now felt heavy with unease. Guests spoke in hushed voices, and the staff moved quietly through the halls, as if afraid to disturb something unseen. Inspector Farouk had begun his investigation immediately. The police questioned the hotel staff, checked the entrances and gates, and carefully examined the path where Susan's body had been found. By late afternoon, the inspector gathered the small group in one of the hotel's quiet sitting rooms. Miss Marple sat calmly in a corner chair with her knitting in her hands. Though her needles moved slowly, her sharp eyes were watching everything. David Carter paced nervously near the window. Mary sat silently on a sofa, looking pale and shaken. Karim Hassan stood near the fireplace with his usual calm expression, while his sister Layla sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Inspector Farouk opened his notebook. "We must establish everyone's movements last night," he said, firmly. He turned first to Karim. "You drove the group back from the city yesterday evening?" "Yes," Karim replied calmly. "And Miss Susan?" "She asked me to stop the car near the side gate of the hotel," Karim explained. "She said she wished to walk the rest of the way." The inspector nodded and made a note. David spoke next. "I saw her enter the courtyard shortly afterward," he said. "At least I believe it was her." Miss Marple looked up quietly at that remark. "You believe it was her?" she asked gently. David hesitated. "Well, it was dark." Miss Marple said nothing further, but the inspector noticed the slight tension in the room. The questioning continued. Layla spoke softly when it was her turn. "I remained in the courtyard after dinner," she said. "I did not see Susan again." Inspector Farouk closed his notebook. "For now," he said, "that will be sufficient." The group slowly began to leave the room. Miss Marple remained seated. As Layla stood to go, Miss Marple noticed something interesting. Several thin scratches ran across the back of Layla's hand. They looked fresh. "My dear Miss Layla," Miss Marple said gently, "those marks appear painful." Layla quickly pulled her hand closer to her side. "Oh, it is nothing," she said quickly. "I must have caught it on a branch while walking earlier." Miss Marple nodded politely. Of course, but her thoughtful expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. Later that evening, the group gathered again in the courtyard for dinner. The mood was tense. David spoke very little now, and Mary seemed deeply troubled by the day's events. Miss Marple quietly observed everyone. Her eyes moved slowly from face to face, noting every small detail. Then she noticed something curious. Karim had placed his dark coat on the back of his chair. Miss Marple glanced at it casually and immediately saw something missing. One of the coat buttons was gone. Miss Marple continued knitting as if she had noticed nothing. But her mind was now moving very quickly. After dinner, she took a short walk along the garden path beside the Nile. The river shimmered beneath the moonlight, moving steadily through the darkness. Miss Marple paused near the garden wall. In her long life, she had solved many mysteries, and she had learned that the truth rarely appeared all at once. Instead, it arrived in small pieces. A nervous glance, a careless remark, a missing button. Miss Marple returned slowly to the hotel. As she entered the corridor leading to the guest rooms, she noticed another detail. A faint trace of dust on the carpet outside David Carter's room. The same pale desert dust that covered the path where Susan had been found. Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment, studying the mark. Then she nodded slightly to herself. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clear picture. Somewhere within this small group, someone was lying. And though the truth was still hidden beneath several layers of fear and deception, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. Very soon, those layers would begin to fall away, because human nature, she had often observed, was remarkably poor at hiding guilt, and guilt, once it appeared, always left footprints behind. Chapter 7. Miss Marple's Quiet Realization. The next morning dawned calm and bright over the Nile, as though nothing terrible had happened the day before. The river moved slowly beneath the golden sunlight, and the palm trees swayed gently in the warm breeze. Yet inside the Sphinx View Hotel, the mood remained tense and unsettled. Everyone knew that Susan's death had not been an accident. Someone among them had led the young maid to the lonely desert path where her life had ended. And that knowledge made every conversation feel cautious and strained. Miss Marple sat alone in the garden beside the river, knitting quietly as she had done many times before. To anyone watching, she appeared completely peaceful, but her mind was working carefully. She had spent most of the night thinking about the small details she had noticed since arriving in Egypt. The scratches on Layla's hand, the missing button from Kareem's coat, the strange remark David had made about seeing Susan in the courtyard, and the faint desert dust she had seen outside David's room. Each detail by itself might mean very little, but together they formed a pattern. Miss Marple believed strongly in patterns, because human behavior, she often said, was very much like knitting. At first, the wool looked like a tangled mess, but if one followed the threads carefully, the pattern eventually revealed itself. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and stood slowly. It was time to speak with Inspector Farouk. She found him in the hotel lounge, studying several notes from the previous day's investigation. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "may I have a moment of your time?" He looked up respectfully. "Of course." Miss Marple sat opposite him. "I believe I understand what happened to Susan." Inspector Farouk leaned forward slightly. "Please continue." Miss Marple spoke calmly, her voice soft but certain. "Susan discovered something unfortunate." The inspector waited patiently. "She saw Mr. David Carter and Miss Layla Hassan together," Miss Marple said. Inspector Farouk frowned slightly. "You believe they were having an affair?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Susan saw them arguing in the garden the evening before she disappeared." The inspector made a note. "And Susan threatened to reveal this to Mrs. Carter?" "That seems likely," Miss Marple replied. Inspector Farouk folded his arms thoughtfully. "That still leaves the question of the murder." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, and that is where the pattern becomes clearer." She began listing the clues calmly. "First, the scratches on Miss Layla's hand. They look very much like the marks left by someone trying to defend herself." The inspector nodded slowly. "And Susan clearly struggled with someone," Miss Marple continued. "Second, the button found near Susan's body." "The one belonging to Kareem's coat?" the inspector said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but I do not believe Kareem was wearing the coat that evening." The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly. "You believe someone else wore it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed." She paused briefly. "And finally, there is Mr. Carter's remark." Inspector Farouk looked up. "What remark?" Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "When we first searched for Susan, Mr. Carter said he believed he saw her enter the courtyard." "Yes." "But the courtyard lights were dim, and he admitted he was not certain." Miss Marple's eyes were now very sharp. Yet somehow Mr. Carter spoke with unusual confidence about Susan's movements. The inspector leaned forward. "You believe he followed her?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes." Inspector Farouk stood immediately. "Then we must bring everyone together." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, Inspector, I believe the time has come." Within an hour, everyone had gathered in Kareem's drawing room. David Carter stood near the window, looking uneasy. Mary sat quietly in a chair, her face pale. Kareem and Layla stood beside the fireplace. Inspector Farouk remained near the door. Miss Marple stepped forward calmly. Her voice was gentle, but every word carried quiet certainty. "Susan discovered a dangerous secret," she said. The room fell silent. "She saw Mr. David Carter and Miss Layla Hassan together." Layla lowered her head. Miss Marple continued calmly. "Susan confronted them near the desert path." She turned toward Layla. "You struggled with her." Layla's hands began to tremble. "But Susan escaped," Miss Marple said. Then she slowly turned toward David Carter. And Mr. Carter followed her. The room became perfectly silent. David stared at her. Miss Marple spoke one final sentence. And that is where the truth truly begins. Chapter 8. The Truth Beneath the Nile. The drawing room of Karim Hassan's house had never felt so quiet. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Outside, the Nile flowed peacefully as it always had, calm and indifferent to the troubles of human lives. Inside the room, however, every face was tense. Inspector Farouk stood near the doorway with his notebook in hand. Karim remained by the fireplace, his expression serious and watchful. Layla sat stiffly in a chair, her hands trembling slightly. Mary Carter looked pale, her eyes fixed anxiously on the floor, and David Carter stood near the window, staring at Miss Marple with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Miss Marple remained calm, her hands folded neatly before her. She had just spoken the words that had broken the quiet tension in the room. And Mr. Carter followed her. David forced a short laugh. "This is absurd," he said sharply. "You have no proof of such a thing." Miss Marple regarded him gently. "My dear Mr. Carter, the truth often reveals itself through the smallest mistakes." Inspector Farouk stepped forward slightly. "Perhaps you would explain your reasoning, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple nodded politely. "Certainly." She turned first toward Layla. Miss Layla confronted Susan near the desert path. Susan had discovered something she was never meant to see. Your secret meetings with Mr. Carter. Layla lowered her head. Her shoulders shook slightly. "You were frightened," Miss Marple continued softly. "Susan threatened to tell Mrs. Carter." Mary looked up suddenly, her eyes wide with shock. Layla spoke in a weak voice. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I only wanted her to stay silent." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, but Susan refused and she struggled with you." She glanced toward Layla's scratched hands. "The marks on your hand were left when Susan tried to defend herself." Layla covered her face with trembling fingers. "I pushed her away," she whispered. "She ran toward the path." Miss Marple turned slowly toward David, and that is when Mr. Carter made his decision. David's face had turned pale. "You cannot prove that," he said again, though his voice had lost much of its confidence. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You borrowed Karim's coat." Karim looked startled. "My coat?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, the button found near Susan's body belonged to that coat." Inspector Farouk spoke firmly. "The coat was indeed missing a button?" David clenched his jaw. "That proves nothing." Miss Marple continued calmly. "You wore the coat so that suspicion might fall upon Karim if the police discovered the button." David said nothing. Miss Marple's eyes were now very steady. Susan was frightened after her struggle with Miss Layla. She tried to leave by the desert path. The room remained silent. "But you followed her," Miss Marple said quietly. David's breathing grew heavier. "She begged you not to harm her," Miss Marple continued gently. "But you believed she would reveal your secret." Mary stared at her husband in horror. "You strangled her," Miss Marple said softly. The terrible words filled the room. David suddenly slammed his hand against the table. "She would have destroyed everything!" he shouted. Mary gasped. David's voice trembled with anger and fear. "She was going to tell Mary. Everything would have been ruined." Layla began to cry, quietly. Inspector Farouk stepped forward immediately. "Mr. David Carter, you are under arrest for the murder of Susan Miller." David lowered his head slowly, the anger drained from his face, leaving only exhaustion and regret. Layla looked up with tearful eyes. "I never meant for it to happen like this," she whispered. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "Most tragedies begin that way," she said softly. The inspector signaled to the constables waiting outside the room. Within moments, David and Layla were taken away. Mary remained seated in silence, unable to speak. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the window. Outside, the Nile flowed peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. Boats moved slowly across the water, and the distant desert hills shimmered quietly beneath the sky. The ancient river had witnessed countless human stories over the centuries, stories of love, betrayal, fear, and loss. Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed no matter where one travelled. Even beneath the beauty of Egypt's golden sunlight, the same old secrets of the human heart could still lead to tragedy. After a moment, she turned back toward the room. The mystery had reached its end, but the memory of Susan, a kind and hard-working girl who had simply seen too much, would remain with her for a long time. Miss Marple quietly picked up her knitting, and outside the Nile continued its endless journey through history.
If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Also let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I'd love to know.